Hello and welcome to On Air with Aashka. Today we are joined by Quinn and Next Riaz as our privileged guest. Quinn is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he focuses on the government uses of AI. He has a background in technology and civil rights and holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California.
We've seen real interest from state lawmakers in AI regulation. It's only a couple months into the 2025 legislative session. Definitely way more AI bills than just 35, but over 35 focus on public sector AI alone.
Imagine your city's new AI assistant announcing, "I'll be managing public services using Tacit." But what does Tacit really mean for government AI? Come join us as we decode the Tacit framework for responsible public sector AI. Tacit, T for testing. How do governments create sandboxes to safely experiment with AI without risking citizens?
Toaster A got really bad safety ratings, and Toaster B got really good safety ratings. You would probably say, I'm going to buy Toaster B, right? When we think about, though, public sector, you don't have the same choice. Government doesn't beta test. Government doesn't have room to get things wrong because the stakes are so high.
A for accountability. Why do Maryland and New York lead with their AI governance structures?
It requires that state agencies create inventories of all of their AI use cases and then make those publicly available. I think it's a really important way to communicate to state residents, this is how we are using these tech. The bill essentially defines high-risk systems that have a meaningful impact on people's rights and safety.
C for collaboration. How does the GovAI coalition enable collaboration among different states?
The GovAI coalition I mentioned, I think, is a really good example of that. So their work has expanded beyond how do we work with the vendor community well, what can we share with one another about successful pilots or like citywide rollouts we're doing.
I for implementation. How can citizens influence the AI systems that affect their daily lives?
All of us have a voice in how government delivers services.
Yeah.
You are a constituent of a government. You have a voice and a way to give them feedback about how you're impacted by the use of AI in government services.
T for transparency. The critical importance of public AI use case inventories.
AI to be effective requires, the public to accept its adoption, which means you need to have public trust. And transparency is a cornerstone of public
trust. Let's explore the Tacit framework for public sector AI before they start making decisions about your benefits, services, and rights. I have worked in the private sector AI companies, and I have seen that many private sector AI companies face competitive pressures that sometimes leads to rushing products to the market before thorough safety testing. So do you see similar kind of tensions in the public sector as well, where agencies might implement AI systems prematurely without doing enough safety testing or without putting enough guardrails in place? And if so, what do you consider the most significant risks when government agencies deploy AI without proper guardrails in place? And do you have any particular example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the kind of core difference that I want people to have in mind when you think about private versus public sector is essentially the fundamental role of choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Generally, consumers in the private market have some degree of choice over where you spend your money and what products you use. So if there were two products that serve the same purpose, say, let's use toasters, for instance, and Toaster A got really bad safety ratings, and you're starting to read some headlines that they explode, someone's home was set on fire, and Toaster B got really good safety ratings, doesn't have any reports of explosions or fires, you would probably say, I'm going to buy Toaster B, right? When we think about, though, public sector, you don't have the same choice.
Yeah.
That's part of why the DOGE issues are so concerning, because this is information, in that context, this information talking about people have to give it over to government, right? Or if you want, when we're thinking about specific government services, if you want to get food assistance like SNAP, you have to go to the SNAP program in the state that you live in. You don't have a choice about where else to go. And if they say, okay, to apply, you go through this portal, it goes to this AI tool, and that's how we make our decision. By and large, you don't have a way to say, I don't want to go through this process. So I think that's really what raises the bar of what government needs to do when they're thinking about deploying these tools. And I think a lot of leaders in this space are starting to recognize this. One example is the state of Maryland. They've done a lot last year around public sector AI governance. And as part of talking about that, they said, government doesn't beta test, basically trying to say government doesn't have room to get things wrong because the stakes are so high. And I think more than that too, like government needs to lead by example, right? To show like what do ideal safeguards look like? Government can play a big role in modeling that behavior as to then, influence industry-wide practices. So I think some of the most significant risks are like to personal rights and safety. If stuff goes wrong, that could mean, if you're thinking about an infrastructure application, that could mean really critical harm to people on the ground, right? If traffic lights don't work, that could be car crashes.
Yes.
It could mean like literally a matter of life or death. It could also be a matter of people's rights protected by law. If you have a right to a specific service or benefit, but an AI tool is wrongly denying you that benefit, that's a denial of your property rights.
Denial of service kind of a thing.
Exactly. So the stakes are high, and oftentimes when we think about government services, it's serving the most vulnerable among us. And so there often isn't then the wiggle room to suffer even a temporary loss to go through an appeals process to rectify a wrong decision, right? If what you're applying for is cash assistance because you've just like lost a job, like we were talking about, you might not have 2 weeks to wait to get the money to pay your rent or whatever.
Yeah, of course, you need it ASAP.
Exactly. So, another example to kind of think about this, that a few states now, but I'll talk about an example from Arkansas. Kevin DeLevon, who now runs the organization Tectonic Justice, worked there, and the state Medicaid program, right? So that's health insurance for low-income people, people with disabilities, rolled out an algorithmic tool to basically determine the amount of benefits people would get. And it was drastically cutting benefits people were eligible for. So it was people that were, at one point eligible for, let's say, 10 hours of in-home help every day were now being told they'd have to make do with half that amount of help from a medical assistant. This example, as you might imagine, had real serious impacts on people's quality of life, health, ability to go about everyday things. Kevin DeLevon led lawsuits with plaintiffs that challenged that use and won. So this is, thankfully a good outcome, but that kind of thing is all too common. And oftentimes the people being impacted most have the least resources to challenge those uses. So I think that kind of help illustrates it, but it's, the kind of risks are endless.
Yeah.
And really high stakes in the public sector context.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's move on to the next question. The private sector, you spoke about testing the AI models or agents in a controlled environment. So the UAE government and other countries as well have been trying to implement AI sandboxes, wherein government agencies can test their AI applications in a controlled environment. Of course, governments cannot do beta testing with the users themselves. So this is the kind of testing that the other governments are trying to do. So like, does the US have similar testing grounds for public sector AI? And can you walk us through the process briefly?
Yes. So both at the state level, a lot of states are rolling out pilot programs to figure out essentially when and how AI can be helpful in the delivery of government services. And we're seeing some similar initiatives happening in federal agencies. But as states tackle this, I think the core idea is you want to have a small scale controlled environment where you can experiment to see what works, what doesn't before rolling something out statewide. So this is a way to do something that you might not do on a bigger scale with guardrails and with public input before a larger amount of time or money is invested into something. So last year, a lot of states issued executive orders on public sector uses of AI, and this was a really common trend across states. So I'd expect it to be something we keep seeing. And I think in general, it can be helpful. But what's important, though, is that as states or federal agencies roll out sandbox and pilot programs, they still need to have safeguards and parameters around how they happen. There still needs to be some degree of risk assessment and testing before even a pilot happens, and some way for monitoring and stopping something if risks become too high. And then after the fact, like after a pilot is done, to have some sort of look back to say, okay, what are our lessons learned? How could this inform other things? And, a clear stepwise process to go from pilot to, a more kind of mid-sized project to something that's rolled out in a more fulsome way. But in general, I think that can be a really good tool, and that kind of parallel testing of something while you keep the status quo system is a good way to start sussing out what are potential harms or pratfalls we didn't foresee before we started testing this thing.
Yes, yes, yes. And in these kind of pilot programs or pilot testing programs, like, is there interstate collaboration involved? Because of course we know that pilot testing itself, on a smaller scale, is a resource intensive project. So like, are the states sharing the results amongst themselves so that the other states don't reperform the same test? Is there a collaboration going on?
The GovAI coalition I mentioned, I think, is a really good example of that, right? So their work has expanded beyond, how do we work with the vendor community well to say, what can we share with one another about successful
That's
pilots or like citywide rollouts we're doing?
great.
So I think that model is being adopted. Well, more people are joining that coalition, and it's also being adopted in other places so that people can start to share like, well, we've tried this thing and it really didn't work for these reasons, or we tried this other thing and it worked really well in our context.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that that will continue to be a trend. At the federal level, there's, under the Biden administration, they established agency chief AI officers, and they created a chief AI officer council, which largely served as a forum for agencies between one another to do this exact kind of sharing. So I'm hopeful too that that remains a thing both within governments and between governments.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, we need to be frugal while investing on AI, like investing resources on AI. So that's a great initiative. Talking about the state legislations, on January 10th, you published an article mapping out state level AI legislation trends. And then from January 20th, plot twist, we had the presidential transition with dramatically different regulatory attitudes. Now we have a new executive order. JD Vance was suggesting we pump the brakes on AI regulation and just promote AI innovation at any cost. So, how are states reacting to this regulatory roller coaster ride? Are they still sticking to their plans that they had already? What are they doing right now?
Great question. So I think, as folks probably know well, even before for the last several years, states have been really forward leaning on things like data privacy and AI regulation. So, partially because less of that kind of lawmaking was happening at the federal level, and because, there started to be some states that drew real interest on this stuff and other states became interested in joining in as well. This year is no different than those, right? We've seen the continued trends of real interest from state lawmakers in AI regulation. I was just pulling this up. So far, it's only a couple months into the 2025 legislative session. So far, over 35 bills have been introduced specifically focusing just on the public sector AI. So that means there are definitely way more AI bills than just 35, but over 35 focus on public sector AI alone. So I think that's a real strong demonstration that lawmakers show continued interest on this stuff. And these bills range from ones, just focus on the education sector, that establish statewide task forces to look at how agencies are using AI, that create leadership structures or risk management programs. So there's a real wide array of approaches across these bills. But I think the biggest takeaway is state lawmakers continue to be interested in this stuff. I think especially on the public sector side, there's going to be, no matter what happens at the federal level, a real need for state action, because so much about how state agencies run their programs, use technology, handle data is a state level question. So there's a real need for state lawmakers to weigh in, especially on the public sector, to both establish what are the kinds of norms and ethical requirements we want around how our state uses these things, and what kind of coordination structure, what kind of requirements do we need to have in place to make sure those things can happen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in your research, you had pointed out that Maryland and New York have been standouts in terms of state AI legislation. So, what specific elements of their approaches make them particularly strong examples for other states, and which are your favorites, personal favorites?
Yeah, I'll talk about Maryland. So Maryland last year passed, and the governor signed the AI Governance Act of 2024. So this has a couple components, and I think together the components are the kind of real key pieces of what you need, especially in public sector AI governance. So the first is transparency. It requires that state agencies create inventories of all of their AI use cases and then make those publicly available. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but I think it's a really important way to communicate to state residents, this is how we are using these tech. The next thing it does is it puts in a number of risk management requirements for high-risk systems. And the bill essentially defines high-risk systems as systems that have a meaningful impact on people's rights and safety. So for those systems, it says there's a higher bar. You need to do things like impact assessments, have certain monitoring things in place, really to make sure that in those high-impact contexts, you understand the risks, you've mitigated for them, and you have a way to address harms when they occur. The last thing I would say is then also creates a broader, basically statewide governance infrastructure. So they've created what they call the governor's AI subcabinet. So it's represented by leadership from across a bunch of different statewide agencies. And it is this subcabinet that's tasked with overseeing statewide governance of AI. So it's the incubator for developing what are the statewide AI use policies? What are the different guidance or trainings that needs to happen? It's a central coordinating mechanism to create all of the infrastructure that needs to be put in place to make sure the inventories happen, the risk management practices happen, and the other kind of guidelines around AI are put in place. I think those three things together create a real strong framework for the state to make sure that they're using AI in a way that's safe, trustworthy, transparent, and effective. And, other states have approached AI governance, public sector AI governance, by starting with one of those pieces. So other states, for instance, have started by just passing an AI inventory requirement that says all agencies need to create these public inventories of all their AI. So there's not necessarily like a right or wrong way to go about it, but having all of those pieces together in Maryland, I think, is a really comprehensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about New York? Like, what did you like about New York? It's the same thing?
It's a very similar approach. Yeah. You're starting to see, some common trends there. It has similar requirements around an AI inventory, impact assessments, use a similar structure around high-risk systems being the ones subject to those heightened requirements. So, the good thing for state lawmakers and other policymakers is we're starting to see more field-wide agreed upon best practices of what makes sense. And there are a bunch of resources now of other laws or draft legislation that people can draw on. So yeah, those two stand out as kind of having that more comprehensive model and some of the kind of highest watermark of those that we've seen so far.
Got it. So you were stressing more on the AI use case inventories. Can you lay down some important parts that these inventories should have, like information about some particular aspects should be there on their website or whatever, wherever they maintain the inventories?
Yeah, I think the kind of structural things that are important are they're publicly available. Not all states that have implemented these make them publicly available. So making them publicly available is super important. Having them updated frequently, the technologies change quickly. Agencies procure them at a variety of different rates. So making sure they're updated at least annually. Some places don't have a set timeline they have to be updated by, or it's every 2 years or some longer timeline.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, biannually.
Yeah. So having a frequency that they're updated by. So both that there's a point where the public can go and say, I know when I can go look and know that this is up to date, and to make sure you're not missing anything as changes happen quickly. So I think those are the kind of structural things I would say. And then it's actually on the kind of substantive stuff of what goes in them. I think the framework for me is that it shouldn't be a box checking exercise. It shouldn't just be, we put this stuff out there so we can say we put it out there. I think stepping back and asking the question of what is the purpose?
Yeah,
it's about
it should provide the value that it is intended to provide. So it
exactly
makes a lot of sense.
And to engender public trust. And so part of that is providing sufficient detail about what is the system's purpose, not just, this is an AI to detect fraud or something like that, but actually having a real
problem statement and solution, maybe.
Exactly. So a real description of what this thing does, the kind of data it processes. And then, the federal AI inventory under the Biden administration, they released updated guidance about additional information that needed to be included from agencies beyond the kind of basic name, vendor, date of implementation, description. Those things are all important and should be there. To call on agencies to include additional information detailing the different risk mitigation strategies that have been put in place. So to provide more detail about, did you do pre-deployment testing? Is there a notice and appeal process? Do you have human review in place? Did you check these specific privacy protocols? So at the state level, it may not make sense to have, you'll need to adapt the level of detail that makes sense in the specific context, but minimally having some kind of information to provide to people about this is the risk management stuff that's in place for this system, I think is the next step that has to happen beyond simply saying, here's the thing that's in use, but to say, here's how we make sure it's not harming you and working how it's supposed to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I was curious about the states who have not made their AI use case inventories public. What reasons do they have for not making them public? Like, is it just the not having the right bandwidth?
There haven't necessarily been reasons. I don't foresee a reason why not to, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
a core thing for, especially in the government context for AI to be effective requires, the public to accept its adoption, which means you need to have public trust. And transparency is a cornerstone of public trust.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say that I should have said a second ago is, aside from communicating to the public, whether it's researchers or everyday people affected by these tools, the other real helpful thing about inventories is it actually aids government itself in understanding how AI is being used. So I think one of the other reasons you see states starting with these is it's a really helpful tool for lawmakers and other policymakers in the state to go and say, okay, what is the current state of play for how AI is being used in our state in a comprehensive cross-statewide way to then figure out, okay, given how we're currently using these tools, what guidance do we need in place? What policies do we need in place? And what kind of legislation should we consider? So it's not just helpful for the public, it's helpful for lawmakers in the state. And then the last thing, it's also really helpful for the vendor community.
Yes.
Vendors need to understand how government is using AI to understand what government's needs are. So more and more vendors are also seeing these inventories as an invaluable tool for helping them be more responsive to government needs.
Yes. It completes their feedback loop as well, right? Based on the use cases that governments are using. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yes, so as we wrap up, I would like to get your views on how can people thrive alongside AI? Like what skills or mindsets do you believe will make someone truly irreplaceable in this AI age and transform the society the way they intend to? So what advice would you give our listeners to prepare themselves for this rapidly changing and evolving landscape?
Sure, I'll give you two answers. One will be my public sector specific one, and then one will be the kind of more meta one.
Yeah, we are ready to hear both.
Okay. On the public sector side, I think it's keeping in mind, like, what is the actual North Star? The North Star is not AI for AI's sake or technology for technology's sake or digitization for digitization's sake. The North Star is having government services that are responsive, dignified, and serve the needs of real people. AI can play a role in that. It doesn't always. But if you keep that as the North Star, when you do use AI, it will be done so in a way that's safe, responsible, trustworthy, etc. So, right, for me, it's remembering, like, what is the fundamental purpose of a government and government services, and how can technology work in service of that, not the other way around. So that would be my answer for public sector. I think on a more meta scale, one of the things in grad school I studied was the history of science and technology policy. So a lot of what I looked at was pre-internet technologies and how some of those regulatory debates shaped the regulation landscape for the early internet. And one thing I like to keep in mind is we've been here before. Even when something feels really new, really unsettling, really chaotic, we've kind of been having a lot of the same argument time and time again.
Yeah.
So in the past, new technologies like cable TV even, or the landline or the internet were these seismic events that were massively disruptive for governments, for economies. There was a lot of regulatory debate about how much regulation was good, how much regulation was bad. And things got worked out, some things didn't. We still deal with some of the problems
Dealing with it, yeah.
we didn't address then. But in this moment where everything can feel so new, in some ways it's also not new. Again, kind of keeping in mind, what are our objectives on a bigger scale? How do we want to think about preserving democratic values, rights, liberty, free expression, and how can technology, whether it's AI or other things, support those is the key. And remembering, like, as much as this feels like some crazy moment, this happens with a lot of emerging technologies, and there are ways to figure this out. And we actually have models we can draw on from the past and from the more recent past as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good response. And of course, in this AI age, people with different kinds of degrees like philosophy or, as you mentioned, chemistry are now realizing the importance of their degrees in the AI space, different kind of opinion or perspective that is needed from their particular field to the field of AI. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this. We are like just in time. We are completing this episode. We are just 5 minutes away.
The last thing I would say, just on your last point, the last thing I would say is, all of us have a voice in how government delivers services. If
Yeah.
you are a constituent of a government, you have a voice and a way to give them feedback about how you're impacted by the use of AI in government services. So
Yeah.
you don't need a technical degree. You don't need an advanced degree. You don't even actually need to know anything about AI to engage with your government, whether it's your city, your county, your state, federal government, to talk to them about what AI means for you. So I would hope people would come away from this feeling empowered to engage on these issues,
Yeah.
and especially when AI is used in a way that directly affects your rights. And I think
Yes.
the government context is a great place to start on these issues.
Yes, 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 yes. So we have been using the weather conversations as conversation starters because, of course, weather affects us all. So looking forward to people having AI conversations as conversation starters, like AI policy, governance, because it is also going to affect all of us, just like the weather does. So, yeah, it's a great way to start as an individual without any knowledge or a degree. So, that's a great response. Thank you so much. Please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to make the YouTube algorithm happy. Help us build an informed community that is excited about AI's benefits while staying aware of its risks. We would love to know, what's your biggest concern about government use of AI? Is it privacy? Is it algorithmic bias? Is it lack of human oversight? Or perhaps the absence of clear opt out options? Have you ever interacted with a government AI system without even realizing it? Haven't seen part 1 yet? Please go check it out to learn more about Elon Musk's Doge privacy crisis, how do government agencies choose and evaluate AI models, and much more. Find the link somewhere here or in the description below. Stay tuned for more such episodes. This is Ashka signing off for now. Let's ride these airwaves again soon.